right, so now we'll get started with the present topic, which is about refuge. And so to get started with that, I would first encourage everyone to examine your motivation. And so the primary motivation for Buddhist practice is to attain liberation. And on a very fundamental level, to attain liberation for oneself, and on an even greater level, from the perspective of the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, to attain Buddhahood for the sake of all beings, to free others from suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment. That's called the attitude of bodhicitta. And so with any and all activities, as we embark on this path, it's important, motivation is considered a really key factor with anything that we do. If the motivation is good, as it said, then where you go and the path you travel will be good. And if the motivation is bad, then the path you travel and the place you end up will be bad. And therefore, since all depends upon this wholesome motivation, I'm paraphrasing a famous quote that says, if your motivation is good, the place you go and the path you travel will be good. If your motivation is bad, the place you go and the path you travel will be bad. Since all depends upon this wholesome motivation, I encourage you to make efforts in generating that wholesome attitude. And the wholesome attitude being spoken about there is the attitude of bodhicitta, that is, the wish to free all beings from suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment. And so I would encourage you all to begin this teaching session, this discussion session, by bringing up that attitude for yourself and thinking that whatever I hear in this session, I will contemplate it and put it into practice in order to free all beings from suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment. So the present topic now is going to be refuge, and refuge is considered, the foundation of the Buddhist path. So I want to talk about refuge kind of just more generally, and then I'll speak of it in its role and kind of ritual role, practical role, all those kind of roles that it can be talked about from a traditional Buddhist path. So in that, my first thought was to give like a more traditional like breakdown of, there's a traditional way of talking about this. There's the person that takes refuge. There's the that to which they go for refuge, how they go for refuge, the benefits of going for refuge, training in refuge, all these kind of things. And I'll talk about that a bit later. But before we get into those kind of traditional topics, I want to talk just about refuge in general. So what does it even mean, and what's the point? So everyone, according to Buddhism, wants happiness and doesn't want to suffer. And in their pursuit of happiness, they engage in all kinds of things. Some things that may be pragmatic and effective in actually ensuring happiness, but oftentimes most of the things that we're doing that we think are going to make us happy actually don't. And there's a famous quote from Shantideva that says, even though beings wish for happiness, they don't understand its causes, and then they end up destroying their own happiness as if it was their very enemy, something like that, because they don't understand actually what's the cause of happiness and what's the cause of suffering. So if we're actually trying to overcome suffering, and not right now, I'm just speaking on a practical level for ourselves. We can talk about this more universalist attitude of bodhicitta more later, but for now, just even thinking about ourselves. If we want to overcome suffering, if we want to gain happiness, then we have to know how to do that. We have to know actually what's going to ensure that happiness. And maybe we even need to know further, what is happiness, and explore that topic some more. So we find ourselves, seeking happiness in all kinds of ways and trying to avoid discomfort or suffering in all kinds of ways. And everything that we do from one perspective, we could call that taking refuge. We take refuge from boredom by distracting ourselves with all kinds of entertainment, shopping, any kind of things that prevent us from feeling what we might call bored. And often that comes down to just a general, a general anxiety or existential angst where we just can't sit still and we can't just be content with what we are. So we're always seeking something out there that we think is going to make us happy. So whether we call it that or not, that's the principle, that we are seeking refuge in things that are outside of us hoping that they're going to make us happy, hoping that they're going to help us overcome a state of dissatisfaction or suffering. And often I would like to come back around this word suffering that we use in Buddhism a lot. It is one way of translating the word dukkha from Sanskrit and Pali, but that word in English has a very intense feel. And in the traditional languages, it is more of a sense of dissatisfaction, discontentment, something like that. So if we're trying to overcome discontentment, we try all kinds of ways. And if we're really looking inward and seeing if those things actually work, we may find that they work for a moment, or they may distract us for a moment, but that they're actually not leading to any kind of lasting experience of happiness, that they're not actually changing the fundamental situation of discomfort. So when we talk about refuge in Buddhism, this whole topic has to be considered. What is discomfort? Why are we suffering? Why are we uncomfortable? What could we do about that? Are the methods that we've been employing effective or not? Can we actually gain happiness out there by perfecting some situation in the world? Can we buy our way into happiness? Can we buy our way into a situation where we no longer have to feel suffering or discomfort? So these are important things to actually contemplate for ourselves, because most of the time, whether we acknowledge it in that way or not, that's what we're doing. We're not addressing the fundamental causes of our discomfort, and we're actually just looking for some kind of solution out there that we think if we could get the right situation, if we could perfect the outer circumstances, if we could have the perfect job or buy that new piece of clothing or get the perfect house or have the perfect partner, that then everything will be great and we won't have to feel uncomfortable anymore. But it's a constant, we're in this cycle. We get to the top. You might think of the top as like that experience of, ooh, I got the thing I wanted. And for a moment, you're distracted by the dopamine fix or the temporary feeling of elation from getting the thing you wanted. But then you fall back down. That just becomes the norm. And then you find yourself right back where you were. Now that thing didn't actually solve the fundamental problem of discomfort or suffering or ignorance or whatever we want to talk about. It just kind of distracted me from it for a while, and then I find myself back in the same place. So these are all important things to think about, but also to kind of take that understanding with you and gain experience of. It's from this perspective that we gain something that is called, in the traditional language, renunciation, or you could say, renunciation is the most common translation, but really what it is a real wish to break free of this cycle. We go up, we think we got it really great, and then we just find ourselves back where we started. And, in one lifetime or even over the course of a few hours, we can experience that cycle. Or according to Buddhism, we've been doing this for many, many lifetimes, again and again and again and again, thinking that we can outsmart something which is maybe a more fundamental flaw in our own way of perceiving the world. We think we can somehow fix that by fixing things outside of us. That is a fundamentally flawed perspective, according to Buddhism. And to overcome that, then we have to find, if these other sources of refuge, like distraction, entertainment, even I hate to disparage like human relationship because it's a wonderful thing and we mostly need it. But it's not going to fix us, our fundamental misperception of reality. Fixing that, having the perfect partner, having the perfect relationship with your children or your parents or whatever, that can bring some relativistic comfort, but it's not going to change the fundamental issue, which is keeping you locked in this ongoing cycle of dissatisfaction. So, what is a source of refuge? What is something that could actually do that? Or maybe is there a person that ever figured that out? That's an important question to ask. And to a certain extent, this may be somewhat of a matter of faith, especially for people who are new to all of this. But according to Buddhism, the Buddha Shakyamuni, who is depicted in this painting here, he did that. He figured that out. He accomplished that state for himself. When I say for himself, I mean that he accomplished it. Another way of speaking is he accomplished it for the benefit of others. But, anyway, he did that. He became that. He became a being who had overcome that fundamental situation of suffering or discomfort. He became completely liberated from that ongoing cycle. And then having done that, he was able to explain how you could do that. So he could describe, the Buddha's first teaching after he attained enlightenment, something called the Four Noble Truths. So the Buddha could then describe, what is this state of suffering? What is this state of dissatisfaction? In very detailed terms, not just a few words, but there's different ways of talking about that fundamental state of dissatisfaction. And only one level is more of an overt sense of pain or suffering. The others are quite more subtle than that. So the Buddha was able to describe what is the situation of discomfort. And then, just knowing what it is helpful, but also we have to know why. Why did that happen? Because one of the Buddha's fundamental principles is to stop something from the cause. Once something's already happened, you can't really stop it because the cause is still in place. It's going to keep happening. As long as the seeds of suffering are already planted and all the conditions for that to ripen are still there, once the suffering's already there, you can take pain medicine or you can dull that pain by distracting yourself with entertainment or alcohol or drugs or sex or whatever distracts you. But as long as that seed is still being planted for furthering that experience, it's going to keep ripening. It's going to keep happening. So if you want to stop something, you have to stop it from the cause, from the root. So that's the second of the Four Noble Truths. The Buddha taught that there is a situation of dissatisfaction, of suffering. These are the causes. So those causes, according to the Buddha, are something called karma and afflictive thoughts and emotions. I'm not going to get into super detail about talking about that right now. That's a whole other topic to go deep into the Four Noble Truths. However, just to give you an overview, this is like a way of talking about how or why maybe the Buddha is a reliable source of refuge rather than the way that we normally seek out refuge. So then the Buddha said, okay, that's the bad news, right? The bad news is there's suffering, and here's the causes of that suffering. The good news is there's an end of that suffering. There's something called the cessation of suffering. There's something called liberation or enlightenment. And you could do that. I did that, the Buddha said. I did it. You can do it too. So now, how can you do it? Then that's the fourth noble truth, the truth of the path. So the Buddha was able to set out a path for us to follow, for his followers to be able to discover that same state for themselves. So there's much more to be said about different ways of talking about the Buddha's enlightenment and how to somehow logically prove that to you. And for now, I would like to say that, what this is, what is a Buddha? From one perspective, you could say it's a guy. It's the Buddha Shakyamuni. It's a person. From another perspective, anyone who overcomes all of their afflictive thoughts and emotions, all of their habitual patterns, and fully recognizes the reality that is like the nature of their own mind, the nature of phenomena, that is a Buddha. So if you do that, you're a Buddha. If I do that, I'm a Buddha. The Buddha Shakyamuni did that and therefore became the Buddha. So the Buddha is not, you could say, is not an exception, but is, of course he's exceptional. He did it and we're still here, right? We're still here in our ordinary form. Like, you're here asking how to do this, or like, why would I want to do this, and like exploring. So that means, to me, you're either just curious or you yourself are recognizing that you are in a state of dissatisfaction and you want to find a way out, right? That's what I interpret by even the fact that you're showing up here, you know, that all of us have this fundamental state of dissatisfaction and we want to do something about it. We've discovered that we want to do something about it. And probably we're either already somehow like kind of trusting in the Buddha and Buddhism, or we're at least open to exploring that idea that there is an enlightened being called the Buddha, that his path might work, that it might actually be a real thing and not just a story about someone who lived 2,600 years ago. But the one thing that I could say that are examples are, for one, when we meet a more developed, we might say more spiritually mature person, such as I speak for myself, like Namcha Ken Rinpoche, Tulku Sangha Rinpoche, Chamtor Rinpoche, Jigme Namgyal Rinpoche, Jetsuma Tenzin Palmo, like I'm just listing off some of my teachers. I see in them the qualities that are described when we talk about Buddhas, the qualities of extreme stability of mind, confidence, but not arrogance, but confidence, loving kindness and compassion that is completely unbiased, a lack of afflictions. You know, I don't see them lusting after things. I don't see them angrily like shouting at people. You see this kind of qualities that are described when we talk about a Buddha. So when we talk about a Buddha, it's generally talked about by those two qualities, you know, the elimination of afflictions and ignorance, and the full kind of manifestation, you might say, of the positive qualities of wisdom, love, and power. And so you can see, at least, maybe not like to the extent that it's said of the Buddha Shakyamuni, but you can see those qualities somehow greater than what you have in yourself. And then when you start practicing, for most people, if you're practicing in a way, in a maybe a more directed way, and what I mean by that is following an authentic path with a teacher, you can see the decline, the diminishment of those stronger, more intense afflictive states. And along with that, often an arising of a clarity in one's own mind. And as we go deeper and deeper, even a more natural coming into touch with our own loving kindness, compassion, kindness, and so forth. And just imagine if you kept doing that in a very intense way, maybe in deeper retreats, longer periods of time, over the course of many lifetimes maybe, or even in this life for much more time than we normally have, you know, we could imagine what that might be. Is that true? Do you feel it? So I'm just trying to maybe for those of you who are still on the border, on the fence about whether Buddhas exist or not, hoping to instill a little bit more confidence about what a Buddha is, and that maybe that's a real thing that you could actually do for yourself, and that maybe someone actually already did. And it's not just the Buddha Shakyamuni. Like we, at least according to our tradition and way of talking, so many people have attained enlightenment since the Buddha Shakyamuni. So many. Still, every day probably there's someone who's reaching these upper echelons, and very regularly some people actually attaining enlightenment. Maybe not every day, but very regularly. So it's something that isn't just a story from some book, is a living tradition of Buddhas coming in this world. So where I'm trying to go with this is coming back around to maybe that more traditional way of talking about Buddhist refuge, is an idea that there is, someone who already attained this state, and that they created a path that we could follow, and that there is still an ongoing living legacy of those teachings right now, and people who are supporting those teachings and engaging in those teachings. And that's what we call the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So when we take refuge, what we're saying is, okay, I've tried all this worldly stuff. I've tried to perfect my version of samsara. I've tried to get the good job. I've tried to outsmart my experience of suffering by buying things or fixing things or having the perfect relationships or whatever, and yet I have still found myself in a state where I'm still not content. Or I just recognize, maybe I'm not fed up yet, but I'm recognizing that it's not working, At some point, like, if you keep following this path, you'll probably get to a point where you maybe feel fed up. Like, I've tried, I recognize it's not working, and yet I keep banging my head against the wall trying. So, when we come in contact then with the Buddha's teachings, and we see that there's a different way, and then we start to explore that way, and then maybe we start leaning into that way, then what we're doing by engaging with these teachings is we're taking that as a refuge instead of just seeking happiness, just seeking an overcoming of suffering through some other external situations. And when I say this, yeah, of course, on some level, on one level, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha are some external thing on one level, because the Buddha's not, I'm not the Buddha. The Buddha's this guy, right? I myself am not the Dharma. I myself am not the Sangha. But the way that I relate to them isn't like the way I relate to something that I buy or a distraction that I watch on the TV or something like that. I use them to look in and recontextualize my own circumstances and the way that I'm experiencing myself, the way that I'm experiencing my thoughts and emotions, the way I'm interacting with the world. I use the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha as a mirror and a toolkit to reflect upon and transform, I guess, my own experience of myself and the world. So therefore, I'm no longer just trying to do something out there or trying to acquire something out there, but I've found something that I'm starting to think, as a beginner, starting to think maybe this is worthy of my time. Maybe this is a more trustworthy, a more authentic, a more effective way at overcoming suffering, at gaining happiness. And so I start leaning into that more and more and more. Now, how that works is like I said before, and I'm going to use an example that Ken Rinpoche often uses, Namcha Ken Rinpoche. When he talks about Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, the traditional way of saying that is that we take refuge to the Buddha as the teacher, to the Dharma as the path, and to the Sangha as, sometimes the word is companions, but maybe I think it's better to say something like guides. So Ken Rinpoche's example for this is, let's say you're in Montana. We're in Montana here. I'm in Missoula. And I want to get to New York City. First of all, there has to be someone who's been to New York City before in the past. Okay? Someone has been there and they made it there. I know this sounds kind of abstract because we all know where it is. We all have Google Maps, whatever. But just imagine a time when someone's in Montana and they've never been to New York. Someone has to have been there before. That person who's been there before then also made the path to get there. So the Buddha made the path. That path still exists. So the Dharma still exists now. If the Buddha came, but the Dharma didn't still exist, it wouldn't be that helpful to us. It would just be, like I said before, it would be like a story in some book. There was some guy who got enlightened, but what relevance is that to us if we couldn't have any toolkit to emulate that or to follow that? Then the third part is, okay, someone made the road, but that person's not around anymore. I still need a guide to get me down that road because I could get lost. I could take a wrong turn. So I need a map, or I need, Ken Rinpoche says in modern terms, we need a GPS system. So the Sangha is like a GPS system, or it's like Google Maps, okay? It's going to keep you on track. So the way that we can relate to that in our lives is similarly that, of course, the Buddha came, the Buddha got enlightened, meaning he made it to New York. He made a path, so he gave the teachings on how to get there. That path is still here, but if we just read books about that path and about New York, there's no guarantee that we'll ever make it there. We could get totally distracted and lost in Omaha and find the perfect bowling alley and think that that's the most fun thing ever. And then I don't know, maybe we make it through Kentucky and I don't know, there's some other distraction over there and that seems really exciting. Whatever. there's no guarantee we're going to make it. We need a guide. And that guide is the Sangha. So, it's important to think about these things, first of all, from what are the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So starting to understand more about what is, Buddha as a person is also inspiring to read some like life stories and things like that of the Buddha. One really excellent one is a book called Old Path, White Clouds by Thich Nhat Hanh. It is a kind of biography / telling of the sutras. So it's a really wonderful blend that kind of goes through life story, but also with a lot of the teachings of the Buddha. But more so, and maybe just as importantly, to understand like what Buddhahood is. What is the state of enlightenment? From one perspective, like I said before, that's what we're talking about when we say Buddha. It's not necessarily just the Buddha Shakyamuni. It's the qualities of Buddhahood. The qualities of, in technical terms, sometimes we say pangto, elimination and realization. So that is the eliminating or abandoning of all of the afflictive states or obscuring states, and the realization of the nature of reality. The nature of one's own mind is one way of talking about that. And then, like I said before, when we see that, and when we see that perspective, then we can start to see maybe that that's something possible for us, because it's not just some abstract state like a guy in the sky, like a God who is an exception to the rule, and God's God and you're you and you can't be that. That's not what it's like at all. It's that a Buddha, and I'm not even going to say the Buddha, a Buddha is someone who, like us, but someone who has maybe gone deeper than we have gone yet. And so, I often have said, like, I coach some of our students through the stages of shamatha and vipassana in a program that was started by Ken Rinpoche that's called Walking the Path. And once they get to a certain point in their practice, I've told them, a few of them, once they get to a certain stage of like really good clarity and stability in their shamatha practice, the only difference between you and a person who, it's described in a lot of the texts, someone who's attained like the first dhyana level or something like that, it's described in different texts, different ways. But, in some texts they say someone could sit without moving their body or mind for some crazy amount of time. Let's say 8 hours, 24 hours, something like that. But once you've attained that first bit of stability, the only difference between you and that person is how much time you put into it. It's not crazy that person can do that. It's actually just the exact same principle you've already been working with, taken to a much further degree than you have maybe the commitment to put into it right now. And similarly, with someone who starts to have authentic experiences of emptiness through vipassana meditation, the only difference between that person who's had the first kind of maybe more authentic experiences of emptiness and a full-fledged bodhisattva or even the Buddha, how much time you put into it. How there's more to it to a certain extent. There's other causes and conditions that can help support that path. But on one level, like the emptiness that you've experienced isn't something different. There's maybe a difference in proximity or in precision, but like that taste of emptiness is, like a sip of ocean water, but it's not the whole ocean, something like that, but it's the same water. That's an example that's used in some traditional texts. So anyway, just to relate more to the Buddha as not an exception, but something that we could be, something that we could do, is a better way, or maybe a more optimistic way to relate to the Buddha, rather than seeing him as an exception or something like a god or something like that. And even I'm still saying him, like personifying that it's Buddha Shakyamuni. That's just one way of talking about a Buddha. Now Dharma. This Dharma, in a lot of texts that go deeper into the idea of refuge, I'll just shout out a book here, 2 books here. One is a book that our whole Walking the Path cohort is reading, those shamatha and vipassana students. It's a detailed commentary to The Way of the Bodhisattva by Shantideva that's called The Nectar of Manjushri's Speech. And it's a quite complicated book. It's a technical kind of book, but it gets into deeper discussions of refuge. And then another book called The Treasury of Precious Qualities by Jigme Lingpa. So volume 1 of that is more about sutra level teachings and has a really extensive, really excellent explanation about refuge. And then I'll just leave it with that. But, you know, in those texts, in a more traditional text, when they talk about Dharma, they're not just talking about books or something that the Buddha taught, but there are two ways of talking about this Dharma. One that we call the Dharma of, you could use either the word scripture or transmission. And then there's something called the Dharma of realization. So I'll try and give you a simple example of the difference between those things. So let's say you came to a teaching and I taught you about impermanence. So that everything's impermanent, all your thoughts are impermanent, and tell you to meditate, like looking at, I don't know, you know, there's different ways of talking about it, you know, watching the seasons change or thinking about the seasons change, even thinking about the light changing throughout the day, looking at the impermanence of your own thoughts, that kind of thing. When I teach that, you know, I'm explaining those things and telling you some words and maybe even reading from a book. That's what's called the Dharma of scripture, or the Dharma of transmission, you could say. When you put that into practice and then gain an authentic experience of impermanence, then that becomes the Dharma of realization. So that's how lineage works. That's how lineage is transmitted. So we have a teacher who has realized, you could say, the nature of reality, realized impermanence, realized emptiness, realized the nature of their own mind, something like that. And it's through having that experience, that realization, that they can then guide someone else through those stages themselves. So they transmit the words, but then also guide that student through the stages of experience and practice till they have the experience and realization themselves, that then they could transmit that to a following student, and so on and so forth. And that's how it's gone from the Buddha Shakyamuni all the way down to my own teachers and down to me, and so on and so forth. So that is called the Dharma of Scripture and the Dharma of realization. And one way of talking about the Dharma is, so this is a quote from a text called the Uttara Tantra Shastra, sometimes called the Sublime Continuum. It's called Tantra. It's not a tantric book. Tantra also means continuum or continuity, something like that. And that's a book about Buddha nature. And in that book, it has like a bit of a more profound, a bit more deep explanation of Buddha, of the three jewels of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And in that, one way of defining Dharma is that which is free of attachment and that which frees you of attachment. So you could say that Dharma, in its ultimate sense, is like the nature of reality itself. It is that freedom itself, that state of freedom from attachment. But Dharma is also the thing that will help you to become free of that. Meaning these teachings and your own experiences of them. So you could talk about that your experience of the teaching is the freedom, but also it is, in a path language way, it is a stepping stone of experience until you ultimately attain the freedom of attachment. So it's a deeper way of talking about Dharma, is that it is the nature of reality itself. So from one perspective, it is our gradual experiences and realizations that we gain as we progress down the path. It's the words that help us to communicate that language for us to be able to understand that and then put it into practice. So like you could think of it in 3 stages. The words that express those things, the experiences and realizations in a practitioner's mind, and then the ultimate state of reality itself, which is what a Buddha sees and experiences. That all of those could be talked about as Dharma. So, now Sangha. What is Sangha? So we have a general, what we might call the general Sangha. And in a lot of spiritual circles or Buddhist circles, not even necessarily Buddhist circles, we'll use the word more generally to talk about all the spiritual community. Anyone who's engaged in these kind of practices, who's exploring these kind of traditions. But when we talk about refuge, this is why I choose to, and I kind of prefer to talk about the refuge as guides, not just as companions. Because to really provide refuge for them to be a refuge to us, they have to have like some kind of greater experience and realization than us, you know? Otherwise, it's like the expression, you know, the blind leading the blind. If I'm already like in a state of ignorance and confusion, then how can other people who are at my same level or lower than my level or whatever of practice, how can they be a refuge? Of course, like on a simple level, they provide community, and that feels good, and it feels good to be a part of something and all of that. But on a deeper level, in terms of our spiritual development, our actual kind of source of refuge from the Sangha are our teachers and mentors. You know, it is, for example, when you are working through your practice, the Buddha maybe created this path in the first place. Then you receive some teachings on that. You receive the Dharma, and when you apply that Dharma in your mind, you're taking refuge in the Dharma by actually applying that. You know, you're gaining protection through when you're having an intense emotional experience, and then you can actually recall that understanding of impermanence, directly apply it to that experience, and become free from the suffering of thinking that you're stuck in that state or something like that. You've directly received the protective power. You've received refuge of the Dharma. But then you go deeper into those experiences, and you start maybe having a lot of weird thoughts about that, and a lot of other kinds of experiences that are leading you maybe to be attached to a certain type of experience. And kind of, like I said before, it's like being on that road to New York, but you end up stuck at the bowling alley in Omaha because it seems it's got great neon lights and great nachos or something. So you're like really attached to this experience you're having in meditation. And if you don't have a teacher who's already been beyond that state of practice that you're at, anyone else might say, that's awesome. Maybe you're enlightened now, you know, the other people around you. Maybe you've really gone somewhere really deep in your practice. That's awesome. And just pat you on the back and prop you up, and it's just reinforcing maybe a delusional state or like your ego or something like that. Whereas if you have a teacher who's already been through that, who has already gone beyond where you are, then that teacher can say, oh, that's really wonderful. It's really great that you've made it there, but there's further to go, and kind of re-steer you and keep you on track. You know what I mean? So that is, you know, a function of Sangha. And, you know, from that same text, Uttara Tantra Shastra, it defines the Sangha as those who have the qualities of awareness and freedom. And, you know, it gets deeper than that, but those are the two main qualities. With each of the three jewels, they kind of give these two main qualities. And I'm not going to get deep into that text. It's a pretty profound explanation for some of you that have already gone through some of the more fundamental teachings on refuge and definitions of the three jewels and understandings of emptiness and all this kind of stuff. I would recommend reading that. The Uttara Tantra, there's a really great free PDF book of great teachings from Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche available on the Siddhartha's Intent website. But anyway, when they say awareness and freedom, what that means, this is kind of coming back to what I was talking about before. Let's just say, follow on that example of impermanence. I had an experience of whether I fully kind of am consciously aware of that or not, I am operating from a perspective of thinking everything's permanent. Okay? Myself, the situations around me, my emotional states, all of that. It's kind of our de facto way of being according to Buddhism, is that we have this fixation on things as if they are always going to be what they are. And when I learn about the idea of impermanence, and I actually fully understand that, now I have an awareness of that. An awareness of impermanence. And when I put that into practice, and I actually gain experiences and realizations of that, then I have the quality of freedom. I have been freed from the fixation on permanence. So that's what it's meant by the qualities of awareness and freedom. So from one perspective, you know, we talk about Sangha on many levels. From one perspective, a definition of Sangha is someone who has had some genuine experience of the Dharma, basically. So someone who has the qualities of awareness and freedom. When we're talking deeper in refuge, like I said before, I think it's better to think of it as someone who is somehow like spiritually more advanced than oneself. So it's better maybe to think of who I take refuge for. When I say, like, for example, for some of you who don't know this, some of you may be really new to this idea, there's something called a refuge prayer that most Buddhists will say at the beginning of a practice session or a few times every day or something like that. And in that, we say I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And so that is a way that when we kind of say that prayer, we're reinforcing this kind of directing our attention towards that as a source of refuge rather than what we had been doing in the past. You know, we're kind of reorienting ourselves and keeping ourselves on track. You know, we're setting that intention in mind and making sure that our minds are really trainable in good ways and bad ways. You know, according to Buddhism, like we're kind of a habit machine. And as a practitioner, what we're trying to do on a very fundamental level is train ourselves with better habits and try and untrain the bad habits. That's what, you know, when we say creating good karma or creating merit, you know, those kind of words, basically what that is we're training ourselves in more virtuous ways, which are going to make us more likely, more able, more open to being able to experience reality in a more authentic way. And so one way of kind of training that, I hate to call us machines, so this is very dehumanizing. I'm sorry I even went down that train. But one way of training ourselves is by repeating these kind of things. You know, repeating a refuge prayer, a bodhicitta prayer, aspiration prayers, those kind of things. They're getting our minds, the more we recite those, the more we set those kind of intentions and turn those intentions into habits. Those habits become more and more of our de facto way of interacting with the world. So we can really start when we're feeling a sense of dissatisfaction, when we're feeling a sense of suffering, when we're, you know, that could become an automatic response to want to go towards the Dharma rather than going towards distraction, rather than going towards things that genuinely are not going to work in any kind of ultimate sense. So, you know, most common refuge prayer, I'm going to say an altered version of this because this is the one that we say in the Walking the Path program, but it's in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, or in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the most excellent of gatherings, I take refuge until enlightenment. By the merit of the meditation and practice I do, may Buddhahood be attained to benefit all beings. And so, you know, sometimes that middle line, instead of by the merit of the meditation, it says by the merit of the generosity and so forth that I do. The reason it says generosity and so forth, or generosity and other practices, is it's talking about the 6 perfections. So generosity is the first of those 6. In our meditation class, in our program, we say by the meditation that I do, because Tulku Sanak Rinpoche wrote this book of Shamatha and Vipassana, and in that, you know, he says, say this prayer at the beginning of every meditation session. And because that program is focusing on meditation, it changed the line generosity to meditation. Anyway, by repeating that prayer however many times a day, sometimes, you know, 3 times, you know, and a lot of advice about taking refuge, it says to say a refuge prayer 3 times in the morning and 3 times at night, at least. And this is just, you know, another way of genuinely keeping the connection with that, with our path. It's a way of, like I said before, kind of training ourselves to go for a refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha rather than towards worldly things that we know, or at least we maybe are starting to be open to the idea of aren't really working and aren't going to work. It's not just that they're not working now, but ultimately they're not going to work. And yeah. Sorry, I'm not paying any attention to what time it is. We go till 6:45. 6:40. Okay, so let me start to wrap some things up here because I've just been going on and on. Now, one thing to also know that I have not mentioned at all is that there isn't just a general idea of taking refuge. Then there's something called taking refuge vows, which is another thing. And, you know, some of you may not even know that that's a thing. Some of you may know it's a thing, but don't know what it entails. And maybe want to do it, but don't know how. So I just want to talk a little bit about that topic. So refuge vows, you know, the difference between taking refuge and taking refuge vows is one of if your commitment was really pure, maybe just on a practical level, it's not significantly different, but it is because when one does that with a teacher, and that teacher has a lineage of taking refuge going all the way back to the Buddha, there is like a strength of the commitment that happens in that. There is a strengthening of one's own kind of resolve. There is maybe a particular kind of inspiring kind of blessing that happens in that kind of ceremony. So what happens then is, you would go to a teacher, and in that there is basically just some things that you recite. They say, repeat after me. And basically it's just, until I reach the essence of enlightenment, I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Basically that's what you say. You just say that a few times. But you do it in a more ceremonial way, and then the teacher will ask you, are you happy for me to cut some of your hair? Unfortunately for me, there's not really anything to cut, but this is a reference going back to the time that the Buddha Shakyamuni, when he first left his palace and embarked on his spiritual journey, one of the first things that he did was went before an old spiritual temple, like a stupa, and he cut his own hair off. It was a big thing to have like this princely kind of royal hair in ancient India, and so he cut his hair off, and that was kind of his symbol of stepping forth onto the spiritual journey and leaving the kind of worldly life of being a prince, or just, we can think of that as just shifting our perspective from one of seeking happiness outwardly, and like actually beginning this kind of more formal journey of Buddhist practice. And so there's just a bit of a trimming of the hair, and that's more or less the extent of it. And then some people also have some misunderstandings about this, that if I do that I'm somehow like committing my whole life to being like a devoted student of this teacher who I receive refuge from. That's really not the case at all. There are some more stronger connections that are made in Tantric Buddhism when you receive something called an empowerment. I'm not going to get into what that entails right here in this session. But when it comes to taking refuge, yes, it's important that you feel like a trust and a sense of connection, and that teacher who you receive refuge from has an authentic lineage, and so on and so forth. But it's not the deep, maybe personal commitment to the person as your teacher as some people think it is. It's more like they're a conduit of a lineage of the refuge vows. They're helping you to become, to set forth on your journey. And I'm not saying there's no connection. Like, I still feel like a close connection to the teachers who I've taken refuge vows from. But there isn't that sense of like a deep personal, maybe teacher-student relationship necessarily in that ceremony. Then how and when could one do that? Through our programming, I can only speak for us, and I can say how it's been in my life. So there have been other teachings that I went to that it was just advertised. Hey, there's a Dharma teaching and there will be refuge vows offered if anyone wants to take it. It's never a requirement. You will never, at least in any authentic Buddhist tradition I've ever seen, you will never go to a teaching and be caught off guard, surprised, and told you have to do this. This is entirely something that one would do of their own accord. In our organization, you could probably just show up here in Montana and ask the right person, one of our teachers, and they would do it for you spontaneously, or tell you to come back in a couple days. But through our actual programming, the way it works is that we have this 2-year Walking the Path program of Shamatha and Vipassana. And the first year, we have people saying the refuge vow, or the words of taking refuge every day with the program, but they still haven't taken the refuge vow. And it is in the second year, before they go into the Vipassana section, that it's actually in that program, if you want to continue down the path into Vipassana, it's a requirement to take refuge vows. So you may think, what, you just told me that it'll never be required of me to take refuge vows, but now you're saying that it is. And let me clarify, it is a prerequisite of that program, and the reason is because it goes into some of the deeper teachings of Buddhism, which are talking about selflessness, emptiness, and so on and so forth, that Ken Rinpoche feels are very important, that are talked about within the context of an authentic Buddhist path, and that are not just taught in a kind of secular way with no follow-up with the students. it's actually considered a root downfall in the Bodhisattva vows to teach emptiness to people who are not ready for it. And so, especially meditations on emptiness, analytic, kind of intellectual discussions of emptiness are quite common these days, but to get someone started in a path of Vipassana meditation, going deeply, inquiring into the nature of the self and maybe deconstructing one's perspectives, could be an unhinging thing if someone is not grounded in this greater perspective of the path, loving kindness, compassion, Buddha nature, connection with a teacher, a trajectory towards enlightenment. There are lots of things that a traditional Buddhist path and taking the refuge vows bring a structure and a support to that person that's going to bring a healthy and nurturing experience of meditating on selflessness and emptiness rather than a potentially unsettling, problematic kind of situation. So that is still like entirely up to you. If you want to go deeper into those meditations, then that's just the condition through our organization, and that is for your protection. And so that's how we run things here. And like I said before, it doesn't have to be that structured. You don't have to necessarily go through those programs, but our teachers are quite traditional, and it would be very rare, up to now it has never happened, that they will do that ceremony on the internet. There are some people who have and who will. This kind of changed a lot during COVID. But our teachers, Tokusan Rinpoche, Namcha Ken Rinpoche, I will just say up to now they have not and have, they're generally not into it. It's definitely something that I'll just say, from their perspective, it's something they would want to do in person. I don't want to say anything against anyone else who's done it. Lots of great lamas. Some of my own teachers have done it online, but my teachers here don't want to do that. Another thing, okay, when you take refuge, what are you committing to? Okay, this is another important point. So there are some fundamental things. They're called more like precepts or trainings in refuge. They're not really like rules or vows necessarily. There's another topic called the 5 lay vow holders or lay person's vows, which is kind of a separate thing, another topic. It's not necessarily given with the refuge vows, but could be. So let me just talk about refuge itself and what comes across in a refuge vow ceremony. So it'll say once you have taken, there's basically 3 things to abandon and 3 things to engage with. Okay? So let's start with things to abandon. So it says, once you have taken refuge, one in reference to each of the 3 jewels. Once you've taken refuge in the Buddha, then it says, don't take refuge in worldly gods. Sometimes it says, don't pay homage to worldly gods, different texts. But ultimately what it means is that once you have decided that I'm going to follow this path to the state of enlightenment, I've accepted that the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha are the ultimate sources of refuge, then it doesn't mean to like disrespect other gods or don't ever go to church with your parents again. That's not what it means at all. It means that if you think that somehow, and I'm just going to use a more common American example, if you think that at some point, if you think that like Jesus or Shiva or something like that is going to protect you more than the Buddha, then that's maybe, you could say, like a downfall of your refuge vows. And a way of talking about that from the Buddhist perspective is that, Jesus and Shiva, they're described in all their own books as being passionate, angry, wrathful, lustful. That's samsara. They're not enlightened. They're still themselves trapped within the realm of samsara. They cannot provide an ultimate refuge. And so according to Buddhism, it is kind of considered maybe a breach, a downfall, something like that of your vow of refuge to consider them an ultimate source of refuge. Then when you've taken refuge in the Sangha, in the Dharma, it says don't harm other beings, don't harm sentient beings. And this is also something that, people may have to train in step by step. For example, the Buddha had one student who himself was a butcher. He had to kill animals and then butcher them and so on and so forth. And, at first he said to the butcher, I won't get into the whole story, there's more to it, But he said, what if you just can protect that vow of not killing, or that idea of not harming sentient beings at night? And he said, okay, I can do that, because at night my shop's closed and I'm not killing animals. And I know that sounds like a cop-out, but it's the Buddha's skillful means to be able to embrace everyone. There are a lot of people here in Montana, even some of my friends and people I work with as students, who are hunters. They've been doing it their whole life. And I can't tell them, like, today you want to be into Buddhism, you have to quit hunting. I'm not going to say that, and the Buddha wouldn't say that. But I think it's a successive, training. You can keep on moving forward. As much as I can, I try not to harm beings. And if I do kill an animal for food, something like that, that I don't do it with wishing to harm the animal, but with wishing for providing sustenance for my family, something like that. And I know that this all sounds like a slippery slope. You can talk your way out of different situations. There's a lot of situations in Buddhism that have to deal with a lot of personal responsibility and personal integrity with how you approach these things. So anyway, as best you can, Ken Rinpoche would say to as best you can, do not harm sentient beings. When you've taken refuge in the Sangha, do not associate with people with extreme views. And this is also on the level as best you can, meaning it doesn't mean don't go see your family on Christmas because they're Republicans or because they're hardcore Christians, or my mom's a Southern Baptist, pretty hardcore Christian. I'm not going to cut her out of my life because we have different views, But according to Buddhism, her view is an extremist view. She will say things like, you're going to hell because you don't believe in Jesus and stuff like that, But it doesn't mean cut those people out of your life. It just means that if you spend all of your time surrounding yourself with people with a radically different view of things than you, it's going to be hard for you to continue developing your own commitment and kind of progress in your path. It's going to steer you off your path because, they say, common Buddhist example, maybe this is kind of far out, but I think you all know that sandalwood is a very fragrant wood. And they'll say that if you have a whole forest of sandalwood trees and in the middle of that there's just one ordinary tree, that ordinary tree is going to become infused with the scent of sandalwood. And so in the same way, who we surround ourselves with really matters. So, when we want to embark on the path, it's important that, and like I said, you got to take this according to your own situation. And it's probably not healthy for most people to take this one super radically. Okay, I have to run away from my family. I can't hang out with this person. I can't hang out with that person. This creates all kinds of neurosis. So just as best you can, spend more time with Sangha members. Spend some more time. Try to intentionally set aside some time every week to get together. I know we have some online learning circles, but also you might have some people in your local community who are more spiritually minded. Try to set aside some specific time to develop that, and nurture those relationships. All right, so now the 3 things to do. So now, once you've taken refuge in the Buddha, there's a couple different ways this is talked about, but for one, in some texts it says that you should consider that every image of the Buddha is an actual Buddha and treat it with respect. So if you have a picture of the Buddha, we give you guys pictures of the Buddha to meditate on for walking the path, you should really never put that picture on the floor. I'll just give you an example. Let's say that this book is the picture of the Buddha, and this is just an ordinary book, and I set the picture of the Buddha on my table. Don't put the other book on top of that picture. Put that picture in a place of respect, Treat it really purely. Treat it with respect. Don't step on it. Don't step over it. Don't throw your other papers or newspaper on top of it, that kind of thing. Really, I've become paranoid about these kind of things, that this is not paranoid, but the one of the second ones is to treat, every, in the direct Tibetan way of talking about this, they say treat every letter of every word as if it were the actual Dharma. I think that, in the West we have more secular literature. In Tibet they really didn't have almost any secular literature. Almost anything that was written was a spiritual text or a prayer book or something like that. So I think in the West the better way to talk about this is probably to treat your Dharma text with respect. And so I do the same thing. Never throw a Dharma text on the floor. Also, if this is a secular book and this is a Buddhist book, I actually pulled these off the shelf to show this example in this teaching. This is a secular book about the evolution of language. This is a Dharma book of Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. I would never, and I know this is being extreme, but I would never set this book on top of this book. And if I saw these books sitting like this on a table, I would automatically grab this one and set it on top. I know it's like silly, but it's my way of connecting with that principle. And so, yeah, always try to treat Dharma texts with respect. The third one, in some texts it says to treat even every piece of red or yellow fabric with the respect as if it's the authentic Sangha. I think this is also kind of far out, like we don't really have that connection. Another one of my teachers in some of her teachings, this is a link that we've actually sent to you guys, Jetsun Khandro Rinpoche. She's not really my teacher, but I respect her a lot. Anyway, she taught on this, and she taught it, from a perspective that you should really show respect to all ordained Sangha. And I think that in the West, we don't see a lot of ordained Sangha, and when we do, we don't know how to treat them. But actually in traditional societies of Buddhism, and I think we should adopt this more, that if we're a group of Western students, we're all students of the same teacher, and we're at a Dharma teaching, and there's one of us who decided to take monastic vows, we should offer them tea. We should give them the better seat. They've taken serious vows to commit themselves to the practice on a level that we may never be able to. And it's important to actually show a lot of respect to that and to treat them with respect. So, yeah, and especially in the West, it's extremely hard to have monastic vows, to keep those vows. There's not a lot of support like there is in traditional cultures. So anyway, those are the 3 things to adopt and 3 things to abandon. So, I think some people can get themselves in a bit of a frenzy about whether they're ready to take refuge vows or not. But I would just say that if you are at a point in your life where you want to make a more formal commitment to Buddhist practice, where you're really more serious about turning inward, and you've realized that, or at least you're open to the idea more and more so that you're not going to attain a perfection of the outer world, and even if you get what you thought was the perfect version of the outer world, that's not going to bring ultimate satisfaction. If you are ready to take that next step more seriously and commit to a path, it's easy also we have this spiritual marketplace in the West now. We have so many options. There's so many options of different traditions, yoga, this, kundalini, that, different versions of all kinds of things, meditation apps, all kinds of things. And I think at some point, really settling in and deciding to follow one more exclusively, more authentically, and connecting to a real lineage is an important step for a person who's really wanting to make really genuine strides in developing those kinds of states of experience, realization, freedom, and so forth. So I went on too long now. I'm going to leave it there.